also going to get a chance to dive into some much needed self-care strategies. Before we begin and go through sort of our agenda, we just want to, first of all, Danielle and I be in a state of acknowledgement, and Iris did some of that to start us off, but we want to do a different acknowledgement. And so the word acknowledgement in of itself has many different definitions. But two that really stand out are the first one, to accept the truth or existence of something. The second one being generally recognized, accepted, or admitted. And so I think we can all sort of accept the truth and existence of this pandemic in COVID-19 and the fact that our lives have kind of been shaken up. Our students' lives have been shaken up. So that's sort of accepting truth and existence. But we wanted to just recognize and name that we know that teaching is one of the most important professions, and that you guys have been doing an amazing job tackling and handling all of the things that have been thrown your way. I'm pretty sure as educators, we did not receive any training on how to teach during a pandemic. So Danielle and I just wanted to acknowledge the wonderful job that you're doing. Okay, so now our agenda. We are going to, it's like a 3-part. We are going to start with trauma informed. So just thinking and gaining an understanding about trauma and its impact. We're going to then move to trauma responsive. And so that's where we'll talk about, as an educator, what can you do? What are some of the strategies that you can provide both virtually and in person to your students? And then again, what I think we all need so desperately right now is this idea of being trauma resilient. So how are we taking care of ourselves? How are we keeping wellness at the forefront of our minds? Okay, so this graphic is going to be our anchor for our work today. This graphic comes from 321 Insight, and they just offer a lot of professional development and essential training that's based on best practices, but those trainings come from real life hands-on experiences in real classrooms. So we really appreciate the work that 321 is doing, and we felt like this graphic did an excellent job highlighting a lot of the key components of trauma-informed schools. We are going to talk about all 3 areas. Again, we're going to start here with the understanding trauma and impact, move into what educators can do, and then self-care. And so our first area, we're going to have, very fancy. We are going to talk about the impact. So this is the why, the recognition, the importance of recognizing trauma in students. What is the impact of trauma in the students that we are working with and teaching? So we're first going to take a step back to talk about ACEs. And so if you are familiar with ACEs, this will be a little bit repetitive, but we want to make sure we are setting the foundation. And so when students are experiencing trauma, they are also simultaneously experiencing ACEs. And so ACEs are adverse childhood and community experiences that can occur either in the household, in the community, in the environment that cause students and children lots of toxic stress. When this stress is left unaddressed, ACEs definitely harm children and families and organizations, systems, and communities. And so I'm just going to pause there because a lot of times when we think about the difficulties and the trauma that children are experiencing, we tend to sort of see it as only impacting the children. But trauma is multifaceted, and so it's really important that we're thinking about when students are experiencing trauma, it is also impacting the many systems in which they live and the many systems in which they develop. So when we're thinking about organizations, systems, and communities, we are, in this case, particularly keying in on schools. And so, again, we know that when students are experiencing ACEs, they have a really difficult time responding to stressful events with resiliency. And I think resiliency, and we'll talk about that a little later, is key and critical, because that allows students to bounce back, that allows students to experience difficulty but still be able to press on. But there's good news, because there's been a lot of research that's been conducted that tell us and show us that students can heal from toxic stress. They can heal from adverse experiences in a way in which their communities can then develop, and they can be in caring communities. Danielle and I wanted to highlight this graphic because, again, it shows ACEs in these different facets of household, community, and environment. Household, particularly for teachers right now, I think it's been really difficult as an educator to maybe have an insight into a student's home environment that you might not have seen otherwise being in person. And so being with students being on camera or not being on camera, you being able to hear what's happening in the background, that you might be exposed to a lot of these different ACEs that are in this household tree more than you would like to, or more than you have ever before, seeing as though we are in this pandemic and some students are continuing to learn from home. In the community, right, we are being inundated right now through media and what's happening in our community with structural racism, historical trauma, and violence. And so just thinking about how not only do these things affect us as adults in our community, but how are these contributing to our children and their traumas and the things that they are experiencing. And then lastly, environment. This graphic had pandemic on there, which is unique to think about. And again, never thinking that we would ever be in this situation, but it is something to think about. How is this pandemic contributing to children and their trauma that they might have already been experiencing in their household and communities? And so when we take a look at the impact of childhood trauma, right, the first part is to have recognition. So with a lot of students, sometimes we are not able to even know or recognize that they are experiencing trauma. But sometimes we also don't know what to look for. And so the impact of childhood trauma is certainly multifaceted and affects and impacts many different areas. As a teacher, sometimes it's easy to jump to and think about the things that you see. So like the category of behavior, or if you're thinking about a student's emotions, those are symptoms that typically show up a lot more easily and are just easy to see. But this has us take a step back to think about children's behaviors and emotions aren't the only things that are impacted by trauma. We're talking about brain development and cognition, the ability for students to maintain, inform, and sustain relationships. And so once we have in our minds sort of all of these different facets of the impact of childhood trauma, it then makes it easier to think about the whole child and think about, okay, these trauma-informed strategies, even if I don't see any impact, I have to assume that it could be there. And what are the things that I'm consciously doing and putting in place? One of the things that always stands out to me, if I hope some of you guys got a chance to watch the Nadine Burke-Harris video, because it's just really powerful, and it talks about how childhood trauma affects health across a lifetime. So if we're talking about a child's physical health, as children experience ACEs in their childhood, the higher the ACE score they have, so the more adverse experiences they have, as an adult, they are 2, 3, 4 times more likely to experience health risks. And we're talking about depression, heart disease, suicidality. So again, we are also thinking about long-term impact of childhood trauma. And so the first part of this is recognizing and being aware that these are some of the things that your students could be experiencing. And then tier 1 during COVID-19. And so we know that post or pre-COVID, excuse me, we are implementing our tier 1 strategies, right? And we know that these are things that 100% of our students get across the board, tier 1 level, best practices in teaching, best instructional practice, best social emotional practices. But currently, with now the focus on reopening, some students are going back in person, some students are staying virtual, but there have been, because of COVID, an increase in some of these challenges. And so now we have to kind of up the ante or raise the ceiling in what our tier 1 practices look like. A lot of our students have experienced increased trauma and grief, depression, anxiety, as well as us as adults. And so if we, again, do not know our students' history or do not know what they are experiencing, tier 1 practices give us a way to make sure that all of our students are receiving this information, receiving the strategies. And it's just really important, again, particularly for students who are experiencing trauma, because it's a good framework. And we know that the more that we can give students these strategies, because they're best practices, our students who are experiencing trauma will be able to receive those practices and be able to flourish.
So now that we have this information in terms of what is trauma informed, we want to move on to the next step and think about, how do we become trauma responsive? Now that we have this information, what as an educator can I do in my classroom, in my schools, to support students and make sure that they are receiving the trauma informed care that they need? So we're going to highlight 3 key components of trauma responsive teaching. And so we're going to first think about building relationships. So we don't have a lot of time, but we will think through at least like one of these areas. So we're going to first provide resources. We provided resources for how to build relationships with students. So this is things like, how are you showing interest in your students? How are you modeling positive relationships? And really creating that environment that promotes trust and safety. And then the area of providing predictability. How are you developing these consistent routines and clarity around expectations? And a lot of in these first 2 areas, you receive a lot of training for this in your pre-service teacher training. And if you think back to when you were in school to become a teacher, you learned a lot about how do you build relationships with your students? How do I create environments that are safe? One area that we want to really hone in on today is this idea of teaching regulation. So as part of trauma responsive care, directly teaching students these skills is key to helping them be able to overcome some of the ACEs that Monique shared with you earlier. So we're thinking about, how are we teaching them new coping skills? How are we providing them with opportunities to regulate? And then how are we creating safe and calming spaces that they can feel comfortable and feel like they're in a good space? So why teach regulation? When students experience trauma, they have a natural reaction to this idea of fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm pretty sure many of you have heard of this concept. It's when they're aroused, they have this natural reaction to either fight, flight, or freeze. Also, we teach regulation because it allows students an opportunity to process difficult feelings that they have. So one thing that we have to remember is that our students need the practice and the space to be able to process these feelings. Otherwise, if they hold them in or if they don't have the right tools, then we see a lot of the reactions that we have in the classroom where they explode. And then this skill building is really key. So when we have a student who doesn't know how to read or they don't know how to add, what is our natural reaction as educators? We teach them, right? We teach different skills and we develop their skills in that area. The same thing is true for emotional regulation and for social emotional skills. And then this last part is just really key. I'm sure many of you understand this, is being proactive versus reactive. So our students are going to make us deal with them whichever way. We can be proactive and take the time out of our schedules to teach them these skills and practice them, or we're going to take the time in a reactive manner where they are responding to their emotions in our classroom, but then we have to stop teaching and manage that one student. So we want to think about this as a proactive way to support our students who may have experienced trauma in their life. So we're going to focus in on different regulation strategies today that can help us think about like how can we do this and where can we find the time and space. As educators, some of the things we're always thinking about is time. Like, how do I have time to do this? Where can I do this? How can I do this? What does this look like? So some of the regulation strategies that can be really helpful in the classroom setting, whether virtually or in person, is teaching mindfulness or relaxation activities with students. Skill building. So how are we providing these social skills lessons where we're teaching them how to utilize these skills, when to utilize them? How are we creating calm down spaces in our classroom, either in our classroom or virtually? Bibliotherapy. So that's the use of stories and books to help teach some of these skills. Because sometimes students can identify more with a character going through a situation and learn a skill versus like where it's self-directed. And then also this last idea of personal emotional self-awareness and modeling. So how are we providing that space? So we're not going to have opportunity to go into all areas, but we have provided resources for the areas that we don't go into in depth today in the slides.
So the first strategy is mindfulness, and I'm sure mindfulness seems to be sort of a buzzword, and so I'm sure all of you have heard of it, but essentially it is the idea that students are in a state of being conscious, being aware of the present moment, thinking and acknowledging their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions. Mindfulness is great and can be used during different times. So again, we often think about like, when do I have time to do this? And so we have found these different times that mindfulness can be used and can be really helpful, again, with this lens on thinking about for all students, but particularly students who are experiencing trauma. Morning meetings. So at the beginning of your day, some of the secondary schools, maybe during advisory, after lunch or recess, right? So giving students a chance to reset from some sort of activity in which they might be super hype and they might just need to calm down and come down from. Mindfulness can happen before a test, right? Because it's the idea that, to move from one thing to another to then have to focus and take a test. Having students just get in a calm state of mind to be able to focus and think straight before they have to go and do some sort of assessment. And then during transitions, again, students often have a difficult time regulating themselves when they have to go from one thing to another. And so taking an opportunity to do a mindful minute before or after each of these during these different times can be really helpful. On the screen, we just put up a lot of different ways in which to do mindfulness. So mindfulness is not always just like breathing and taking deep breaths. We really love guided imagery. There's a way to do mindful music. And so playing a song and having students pay attention and key in to one particular part of the song. There's muscle relaxation. So there's lots of different ways to do mindfulness. Mindfulness is not just kind of a narrow thing. So just thinking about when can I do this in my day with my students and what type of mindful activity can I do? In the virtual setting, just to note that there are a lot of videos that you can share your screen and show, or images, like breathing images that you can share your screen and show, and then do it along with students. So they have some sort of visual or some sort of audio that they can follow along with. The next strategy is safe regulation space. And so in different contexts, this is called calm down corner, calm down space, safe space. It looks different in different places, but essentially what this is a dedicated space where students have access to tools to support their self-regulation. It is a space where in the virtual setting, so when we think about how do we create calm down corners or calm down spaces in the virtual setting, because traditionally we think about a dedicated space in a classroom or a dedicated space in the building that students can go to. But this can be in the virtual setting, a space in a student's home. This can be like a breakout room that you send students to. One of the images on here is a virtual calm down corner. And so that teacher created a space for students to go to, and you click on different things that you can do. You can send students to do an activity in the virtual space off to the side. So maybe they're either still on camera or they are still part of the classroom, or they sign off. Many different ways to make that work in the virtual setting. This space is definitely used proactively. And so the calm down space is not a punitive space. It's not a space where kids go when they're non-compliant or when you as the teacher or educator are dysregulated. Again, it's a space where they can access to be able to calm down, regulate their emotions. Another core component is there has to be planned teaching before students go to the calm down corner. And so students have to know when they get there, what are they supposed to do? So what am I supposed to do when I get here? How do I re-enter my classroom, whether it's virtual or in person? And so there needs to be planned teaching around that prior to using the space. So the planned teaching does not happen when you're like telling the student to go to the space and they're like, I don't know what to do. So just making sure that planned teaching is happening. Minimal expectation. So when students are in this space, they're not expected, they should not be expected to do work. There should not be a lot of directions being given. Again, essentially, they should know what to do when they get there. It's okay to give a couple reminders, like, remember, when you're in the when you're in the calm down space or regulation space, safe space, this is what you need to do. But there should not be a lot of words and directions attached to this space. It should be timed. Usually it's around 5 minutes. Students should not be spending 30 minutes in the calm down space. They should know I am in this space for this amount of time. Again, and this is what I need to do to be able to rejoin. And then after this last one is so crucial, making sure that you're debriefing with students, because if they are going to the calm down space to regulate your emotions, you should be able to process with them, like, what were their triggers? Why did you have to come to the calm down space? Was this helpful? You were able to rejoin the class or you weren't able to rejoin the class, and why? So making sure that you're spending that time with that child, debriefing and following up. And then the last strategy, which again is going to be our great segue into self-care, is making sure that you are paying attention to your own emotional self-awareness and that you are modeling that for students. And so it's really important, again, particularly during this time where we are all experiencing our own personal traumas, just knowing what your triggers are. Knowing what are the things that make you ticked, is like having a student turn their camera off, perceived disrespect, like whatever it is, making sure that you know what your triggers are. And just like for students, right, we are always telling them to use their words and express your feelings. It's the same for us as adults and educators, and making sure that we are naming what our feeling is. And that ties into the next one, just modeling emotional vocabulary. A lot of the work around trauma-informed schools with students is making sure that those students have the emotional vocabulary to name what their feelings are, because most of the times those students are guarded and don't have the words to say how it is that they're feeling, because that's not what their experience is in that. And so again, as adults, we are modeling those words. We are modeling calm down strategies. When Miss Leopold is upset, I like to take deep breath. Let's all try that right now. So again, the more that students see what you are doing and what you are modeling, they will follow along. They will take your cues. And then lastly, just being kind to yourself, right? We talk about giving ourselves grace, and it really is true, and particularly important as we are trying to navigate school reopening and all of the things that we are experiencing just as a country. So making sure that we are taking time for ourselves, using positive affirmations, being kind, not having guilt for the things that are happening, and realizing that you are only in control of what you are in control of. And just to note, on the top left is a SNAC acronym, which is just when you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed, something that you can do. Essentially, it involves you just like stopping to take a moment to think about what's happening and what you need to move forward in the moment when you're stressed. if you are feeling like during class, you just need to like take a moment to center yourself, one suggestion that Danielle and I have is like have students read or write or do something independently, because we find when we are moving from one thing to the next, just going, and we're not taking time to hone in on our own emotions and our own stress, it just builds on top of each other and you don't really get to be solutions focused in the moment. So we always talk about we don't have enough time, but maybe think creatively about how students can do something independently for just a short amount of time while you take time for your own self.
So the last year, I just saw in the chat that some teachers said that the term self-care is traumatizing for them or triggers for them. So I apologize in advance. I may trigger you a little bit, but hopefully when we think about it in a different way, maybe it won't feel as triggering, but I'll try not to say the words as much as possible. But the last area you really want to focus in on is how do we become trauma resilient and how do we care for ourselves as educators? I think we've talked a lot about how this has just been a really difficult time that we haven't been prepared for. Like there was no training for this. This was not in the rule book. This is something that we had to kind of figure out and navigate and learn how to do on our feet. So we're kind of building the ship as we're going. So we do want to talk about like how can you take care of yourself in this crucial time. I avoided the words. So when we think about this idea of secondary trauma, kind of where we are. So secondary trauma is the emotional distress that arises when someone vicariously experiences the traumatic experiences of another individual. So when we think about secondary trauma, this is not even talking about pandemic. We're just talking about just naturally being a teacher and being in the classroom with students and knowing them so well and kind of taking on everything that they bring into the classroom each day. So just even before the pandemic, 46% of teachers reported high levels of daily stress, and that's similar to nurses and physicians. So we always hear like, oh, doctors and nurses are so stressed, but teachers, you're experiencing a lot of the similar level of stress that other professions. And then we add on this idea of COVID-19. So not only are we experiencing the things that our students are experiencing, but at the same time, we're also in a traumatic situation that is unique to everyone. So we're bringing in our own personal experiences and traumas that's kind of piling on top of just the natural stress of being an educator and dealing with things. And this idea of secondary trauma, it really impacts your overall functioning and wellness. So and effectiveness, as an educator. So it's important that we talk about it. We not only acknowledge it, but we talk about it and think about it. What can we do to really try to help mitigate some of these effects? So as Monique shared, when we talk about trauma, sometimes it can feel so heavy and it's like, well, is there anything that you can do? And like, what's the point? But we wouldn't give up on our students. So I also want to encourage you not to give up on yourselves when you are in these moments of extreme stress. So when we think about the idea of resilience, we're trying to balance out. We're trying to make sure that we're increasing our protective factors to outweigh the risk factors so that we can be able to function and move forward as we're going through the unknown and the things that we're experiencing. So we do want to talk a little bit about the idea of wellness and self-care, but through a different lens. So typically when you hear the words self-care, you only hear really people saying like, oh, how are you eating? Make sure you exercise, those type of things. So you really hear it really focused around the body. But when we're thinking about it in response to all of the trauma that we've experienced or things that we've experienced, we want to have to think about it as multifaceted because trauma and our response to trauma is multifaceted. So our way of dealing with it has to be multifaceted as well. So when we think about dimensions of trauma-informed self-care, first we're going to think about like our mind. So what are the ways that we're speaking to ourselves? What are our thoughts around things that are going on? And how are we really monitoring those thoughts that are in our mind? How are we shifting those thoughts? How are we fact checking those thoughts to see like, is this creating more stress? And making sure that I know you've probably heard all throughout this time, give yourself grace and being mindful of how you're speaking to yourself. But it's really, really key in this idea of trauma-informed self-care and wellness. And then emotions. So very similar to as Monique was sharing in the previous slide, we have to really be able to manage acknowledge and be able to manage our emotions. So self-regulation is really key. So being aware of like, how do you know when you're stressed? How does your body react to it? How do you respond? What is your emotional response to that? And how are you regulating your emotions in ways that that make sense and do not contribute to your overall level of stress? I'm going to skip body because, again, body is what you normally hear when you hear the idea of self-care. You think about exercise, you think about what are you eating. So those are all important, what you put into your body, how you're treating your body. But the areas I want to kind of focus on this bottom row, because this is the areas that we tend to neglect the most, especially as adults. So when we think about things that are important for our students, when we talk about travel, we always talk about like having that key relationship with an adult, how that's so important. That is important for us as adults as well. Maintaining, sustaining key relationships with people can be a huge form of self-care, but it's usually the first thing that falls off the plate. So, I don't have time to go to lunch with my best friend, or I don't have time to do X, Y, and Z because I'm so overwhelmed, I'm so stressed. And so our natural reaction sometimes is to steer away from those relationships, but those relationships and those positive interactions can really be key in helping us build up those protective factors that balance out the risk. Then this idea of work. So this is like work-life balance. And I know for me, I don't know about everyone else, but I know that has been totally skewed for me in this virtual space, particularly because some of the natural routines that we may have that maybe set those natural boundaries before, like, I'm leaving work, I'm not taking my laptop home, or once I leave work, I'm done with work. Well, when work is in your living room, that's kind of hard to do, right? So how are you thinking about, how are you resetting those boundaries, even though you're in your like home space? So maybe it's when you close your office door, that semblance of closing your classroom door or whatever the case may be, or getting in your car to leave. If you normally had a routine going to work that really helped you kind of get yourself ready for work, how can you create that routine in your home environment? For me, I'm going to talk about music a lot because music is really important to me. So music will get me ready for work. I don't drive to work anymore. So how do I start my morning where I still have some of those routines that help me with that balance and that boundaries, even though I'm in my home space? I always joke to say, like, I don't work from home, I live at work. And I've really been trying to shift that process and that thinking, because it definitely makes a difference. And we have to re-envision what those boundaries look like so that we're creating that work-life balance so we can. And I know work-life balance used to be a trigger for me, like self-care for some people, but you have to really think about how can you recreate that space. And the last area you don't hear a lot about is this idea of spirit. So for some people that may mean something spiritual. For others, it's really just thinking about like, what is good to your soul. So I said that you'll hear me talk about music. Music is healing to my soul. So anytime I'm really stressed, I'm really overwhelmed, I can always find a song that helps to kind of bring me back down to earth. For some people, that may be art. So if you really are someone who appreciates art, you may not have time to go to the museum, but if you're feeling really stressed, how can you take a virtual tour of a museum or look at art or do things that are really just something that like really brings you peace and happiness in your spirit? And really, are you taking the time to identify those things? So Monique shared the SNACK acronym. And sometimes for me, part of SNACK is like the thing that I have to do to get myself going is to listen to a song. So if I have to stop a session with a student, or I have to give them an independent activity and I'm just singing some words, or I may take a mental break to the beach because I like to go to the beach, it's calming for me, then those are the things that I'll do because it's calming for my spirit. So really being able to identify and understand what is calming to your spirit. And when we're able to do these different dimensions or address these different dimensions, then we're really approaching our protective factors and our response to trauma in a more holistic way than just say exercise, do yoga, and take deep breaths, because that doesn't always work for everyone. I can't read some of these comments in the chat. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but on the left side, your phone battery. I know me, if I see my phone battery get this low, first of all, I usually don't let it get this low. And if it does, I'm racing and finding a charger because I have to recharge. I have to make sure that my cell phone battery is up to 100%. The same thing with ourselves. I know the word self-care is traumatizing because we typically don't feel like we have the time to do it, but it has to be a priority. You wouldn't let this happen to your phone. So please take time to take care of yourself and don't let it happen to you. Find a way to recharge, even if it's only at 50% a little bit, and then you recharge later, but make sure you're taking that time to plug in and recharge. Plug into yourself and recharge. So I don't know how the next part goes, but thank you guys so much for your attention, and we're open to any questions you may have.
Thank you.